Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your guest host, Tess Stanton.
Beth Finke loves to read and to write. She moderates the Easterseals national blog, and she writes books too. Her book, Writing Out Loud, delves into the work she does now leading memoir-writing classes for older adults in Chicago. Her first published book, a memoir called Long Time No See, talks about her adjustment to blindness at age 26. Her second book, Safe and Sound, is a children's book about seeing eye dogs. Ever since it won an award for children's literature from the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Beth has kept busy visiting schools to talk with kids about disability awareness, service dogs, and teamwork. During presentations, her seeing eye dog, Luna, guides Beth through narrow hallways, crowded cafeterias, and down stairways to demonstrate some of the ways guide dogs keep their partners safe from harm. In late 2021, Beth was busy writing textbooks for elementary school students. Those textbooks are part of a series of 8 textbooks called Understanding Disability that was published by Cherry Lake Publishing Group. Each textbook is authored by a writer with a disability. Hi, Beth. Thank you so much for being on our podcast today. I am so excited to have you. So could you start out by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and your disability?
Yes, about myself. I was born in Elmhurst, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, and I've lived most of my life in the Chicago area. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 7 years old, and back then they didn't have the technology that they have now or the blood glucose monitoring or anything like that, so we did our best to keep on a diet and take my insulin and things like that. Somebody who has type 1 for 20 years is bound to get one of the complications, which are kidney problems, and amputations, and blindness. I was 25 years old. I was pretty healthy until then and got married. And at the time, I was the assistant director of the study abroad office at the University of Illinois in Champaign. So my husband and I lived down there. That was my year to take everybody who was going to study in Britain to take them and kind of show them the ropes and how to use a phone and all that kind of stuff. So I did that for my week. And then Mike, my husband, met me there, and we honeymooned in Scotland. And I also had to visit a lot of the universities there just to check them out, the ones that we were doing exchanges with. So it was kind of a work, I guess it's funny to have a work honeymoon. But anyway, it was both. When we were in Scotland, Mike was driving around, and some sheep were crossing the road, so we had to stop to let the sheep cross the road. And then I looked at the sheep, and they had spots on them. And I thought, that can't be, I wore contact lenses, so I took my contacts out, I put them back in, and I looked again, and what it was were floaters. I liken it to a snow globe. So if you turn the snow globe upside down, and then you turn it right side up, and the snow just kind of floats around and then finally gets at the bottom. If I would sit still, the floaters would go away. But if I just moved my head, they'd come out again. So obviously we knew something was wrong. So when we got back to the States, I went to an ophthalmologist and was diagnosed with diabetic retinopathy. The blood vessels in your eyes are among the smallest blood vessels you have in your body. And for years and years and years of my having a significant number of high blood sugars, even though we did what we could to prevent that, the small blood vessels would get clogged and break, or before they broke, they'd start to grow a new blood vessel. Your body is pretty amazing. Like another blood vessel, then that would break, and that's what these little dots were, little bits of the blood from those small arteries that were not working right. So that's what that was. So I had laser surgeries. We lived about 150 miles south of Chicago, but we drive up to specialists there and have laser surgeries and hope that that would work. And it worked for a little bit, and then it didn't work, and then it worked for a little bit, and it didn't work, and then I had to go into the hospital for a regular surgery where they replaced the solution in my eye with a saline solution, hoping that would get rid of it. It didn't work that first time, so then I had to have that surgery 3 times. It's pretty painful, and after you're done, the surgery is over, you have to keep your head face down for 30 days. So I was in the hospital, but I was laying in a hemorrhoid pillow. It's what you usually sit on if you're having problems with that, but I would put my face in the middle of it and just lay face down. Social worker brought me a machine so I could listen to books, so I did that. And it was a dark time, sort of, but I always assumed, I was 25, I was not naive, but I was just 25. I thought, well, this is going to work, and I'm going to be fine. But none of the surgeries worked, and so since then I've been totally blind.
Wow, and I understand that your contract as the assistant director of the study abroad office at that university was terminated, and you found out in quite an interesting way. Would you mind telling our listeners about that?
Sure. got back to Champaign-Urbana, and it was the summer. And so I went back to the office where I worked as a study abroad assistant. And the director, she didn't quite know what I would be capable of doing and what I wouldn't be capable of doing. So she said, well, how about, is there something you could do for rehab? And could you go to some rehab facility and learn Braille and learn how to walk around with a cane and stuff like that? And she said, in the summer's slow anyway because there aren't many students here, so do that, and when you come back in the fall, we'll have you all set up. So I went, again, back to Chicago, and I stayed in a Illinois Visually Handicapped Institute was the name of it, but I called it Braille Jail because you had to stay there. You couldn't leave. Of course we couldn't leave. It was all for newly blinded adults. And, we couldn't leave because we didn't know what we were doing. It would be dangerous for us to just walk out the door. It was a good experience to meet all these other people that were in the same boat, so you didn't feel as lonely. I learned Braille. I learned daily living skills, how to vacuum, how to dishes, how to do all that kind of stuff. And then I passed all that, and then I came back to Champaign, and then when I came back to the office, the director said, well, we're moving the office because we need a bigger spot, so why don't you just sit out for a while, and when we move to the new spot, then you can learn that. Okay. But I did believe her. So during that time, I thought, well, why don't I just take a class? I'm here anyway, and I only had my undergraduate degree then. So I thought, well, I'll start working on a master's degree since I have the time. And so I did that, and I wanted to keep working at universities. So I was looking for an advanced degree in higher education. So it was some higher education class for 3 weeks when the professor asked me to come see him after the class. And he said that I needed to go down to the administration building because I hadn't paid my tuition. And I didn't need to pay my tuition because I worked for the university, and you got free tuition if you work for the university. But I went down to the administration building, and I walked in there to see what was going on, and when I got to be the first in line, I explained, and they said, well, no, you're not working with the university. Your contract has been terminated. So my boss never told me, never saw her again. So the ADA would be passed 5 years later.
Wow. I can only imagine how you felt in that moment. And like you mentioned, the ADA was later passed in 1990 that prohibits that kind of employment discrimination. But when we think about the ADA, that kind of employment discrimination isn't something that only occurred hundreds of years ago. That was pretty recent that happened to you. And so it's just remarkable to me to think about the fact that, this is something that the protections against discrimination for people with disabilities in America and employment and otherwise, those protections are pretty recent. And so how has your life changed, if at all, since the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act?
It's changed quite a bit. When it was passed, I didn't want to fight to get back into the office because I didn't want to work with that person. I started writing essays and things like that. I got a talking computer, so I learned how to use the talking computer. I started writing and sending out stories to different magazines. I had friends who would read through the Writer's Digest. The internet wasn't happening yet, so people would just read out loud. We'd look up what's a place that might do a story about disability, what's a place about good health, blah, 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 blah. And I had a baby. Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh. Yes. Yeah. So I was trying to think, what did I do those years? Son was born in 1986, and he was born with significant physical and developmental disabilities that had nothing to do with my diabetes at all. It just was kind of like Down syndrome, sort of. It had to do with chromosomes and stuff like that. So he was in a birth to 3 program, and people came to the house to do occupational therapy and physical therapy. So we got involved sort of in ADA issues through him, too, because when he started school, he went to a regular public school. And for a while, he's in the regular classes, but he had a lot of time with other kids with disabilities. So we learned a lot through Gus, too. So I didn't want to work with that person anymore. I was home with Gus and doing a lot of the caregiving for him, writing, because that's something I could squeeze in between all that. And once Gus started school, I had more time and I could do something. So I did start looking for work and didn't study the ADA, but the idea that there was an Americans with Disabilities Act now, I thought I've got a little power now for, when I apply for a job and somebody says you can't do, So Mike, every week he would read the classifieds out loud to me on Sunday and kind of go through airline pilot. Probably not. It would probably, I don't think that would work. But secretary, receptionist at a real estate office. That might work. And so I'd have my tape recorder and I would just tape those ones that seemed reasonable and call them the next day. Animal poison control hotline. That's one I almost took. I mean, it was overnight. I could just do it overnight. But when I got there was something they said about, well, you won't be fast enough on your feet. You wouldn't have the notes in front of you, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I just didn't use the ADA like I could have, but I just didn't want those jobs. I thought, that's what I win. I get to do, I don't know, I just didn't want to battle at work like that. If they had that attitude right away, you just thought, and that's, I think, something that's changed because now that more people are aware of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I feel they're less apt to tell you can't have this job because you're blind. Yeah, they didn't say you're blind, but because you can't do this, because you can't do this or that or this. So finally, Mike read one. He said, oh, here's one. And he kind of laughed. He said, University Art Department seeking nude models. He read the phone number, which is really funny because it was a real ad, but he read the phone number. So I didn't tell him. But the next day I called them. I got an interview. I passed the audition. I did it for a year or more, a year and a half, I think. Kind of enjoyed it because you have different artists, the teachers teaching the people to illustrate me. And then I got invited to the openings. And by then I had a seeing eye dog. I got my seeing eye dog in that time frame too. So they got double models because they had a dog and me. So, so we went to the art openings and Mike would come with me. He said, well, all these pictures are your bare feet and the dog. Because nobody was drawing me, they were just drawing the dog. And art openings have wine and cheese and all that kind of stuff. So I like being a part of that. It was interesting to not be able to see the finished work, but be a part of their test. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's such an interesting experience and something that's so, I think, cool to be able to add to your resume. I'm sure that was an experience that not a lot of people get.
And I wrote about it. And the story I wrote about it got published in our local independent newspaper, and those are syndicated. So it was published in Sacramento. It was published in Anchorage. It was published in all these towns all over the country. And I was also working on my book, my Long Time No See, my memoir at the time, and I was trying to find a publisher. And so when I brought it to University of Illinois Press and showed my rough draft of my book, the editor there had read my nude modeling article in the paper. And so she already knew I was an interesting person. So sometimes when I go to talk to college classes, I say, okay, here's what you have to do to get your book published. Model nude for art students, write about it, and then you get a publisher. So the University of Illinois published my book in 2003.
There you go. Easy as that. Easy as 1, 2, 3. And I understand also you were able to tell the story of your nude modeling experiences on the Oprah show. Is that correct?
Yes, I was on the Oprah show. It's on in a tricky way. A friend of mine, Dr. Miriam Nelson, she wrote a book called Strong Women Stay Young. And she does not have a disability. She's just a friend of mine. She did all the work to prove, she was a nutrition PhD, to prove that if women lifted weights, their bones would be stronger. They'd be less likely to break their bones by lifting weights. So she was kind of famous. So she had that book out. She came to Chicago to be on the Oprah show, and she called me and asked if I'd want to come. And of course, it was like going to Hamilton back then. You're going to see Oprah. So I said, yeah. And then one of my sisters came with me, and we went to it. But right before, Mim called us from her hotel here in Chicago and said, so she said, I just watched one of these Oprah shows. She's like a goddess or something. She didn't really know because she was such a scientist. She honestly didn't know what Oprah was like. So Mim was on, so she's on the phone, and she said, well, if you can get a question and ask about this or ask about that. And so I was trying to get the question, but they would choose ahead of time who's going to ask the questions, and they put them in the front rows, so they didn't want somebody asking a really weird question. So I didn't get my question, and they didn't pick me. But after the show, there was a thing called After the Show, and the guest would stay and Oprah would stay, but it just wasn't on TV. It was just for the people that were in the live audience. So I got up and acted like I didn't know her, and I just said, I have a hard time figuring out how to exercise. It's hard for me to get to the gym. But then I read Dr. Nelson's book, and I started lifting weights, and I got a job, and guess what I do? I'm a model for art students. And Oprah, she's like, is that true? So the audience laughed, and that was the thing. Then, years later, when Oprah would put together a bunch of after the show bits and make that be the whole show. So I was on that.
There you go. Another thing to add to the resume.
Yeah.
Well, you are a very, very accomplished writer. So I want to switch gears a little bit and ask about your book, Writing Out Loud, which explores your work leading memoir writing classes for older adults. And so I'd like to know more about that. How do you lead your classes and how does it look different from someone leading a class who's sighted?
Head commissioner for the Department of Aging in Chicago was at one of my book events for Long Time No See, which is my first book, the memoir. And she approached me afterwards. Well, she called me afterwards and asked if I would be willing to lead a memoir writing class. Actually, we met in person. Would I be able to lead a memoir writing class? And I said no. My sister, who's a teacher, and I really respect teaching, and I didn't know anything about teaching. And so we're sitting across the table. We were having lunch together, and she pushed this envelope to me and said, well, just take this home and have your husband read it to you and see what you think. So I took it home, and Mike opened it up. He said, it's all filled out. It has your name, your address, it's all, it's got your phone number. It's all you have to do is sign it, and you can have this job. And at the time, I was doing an internship for Easterseals national headquarters, so that was very part-time. And so I thought, well, what the heck? What could possibly go wrong? So I signed that, and I got the gig. We met at the Chicago Cultural Center. So I had to learn how to get to the Chicago Cultural Center. But again, I had a seeing eye dog, so that was pretty easy. I talked to a friend who is not disabled, but she teaches high school and she teaches writing. So she met with me and gave me some ideas of how I might, what kind of assignments I could give. But the thing that was the most important to me was I did not want to be in a class. I pictured we'd be at a table, which we were. I did not want everybody at the class to have each other's essays written out in front of them, and I'd be the only one in the class that wasn't reading the essay. You know what I mean? So, because then I thought, well, I'll be at a disadvantage with these people. So I thought, how could we do this? And at the time, I was also doing every once in a while I'd be asked to go WBEZ to do an essay, to read an essay out loud, so I knew how to do that. Anyway, I got into this, how about the sound instead of the reading the print? So instead of people passing their essays out, writing an essay and passing it out in class, only the person who wrote the essay had it in front of them. And when it was their turn to read, they would read, and everybody just had to listen, just like I did. So that's how I did the class. And there are other little funny things. At first, I just said, one of my prompts was vacation fiasco. So write about a time where you were on vacation and everything went wrong. So they went home and wrote about that. They don't write in class. We just talk in class. They went home and wrote them. I think I might have said keep them short. I can't remember. But, of course, there's always somebody in class who thinks their story is so much more fascinating and more interesting than everybody else that they have to go 1,200 words or something. So we're all listening to this essay, and I didn't quite know how to stop her. I was still early on, and I didn't have the guts to go, stop, this is too much. So after that, I put down a rule that the essays only be 500 words, because when I did the essays out loud for Chicago Public Radio and NPR, they want them 500 words, because that's about how long a person will listen to something. When I said, this is what they do on NPR, they all said, oh, okay, we'll do that then, because that's fancy. So then, and still people would go longer, so I decided how can I stop them? I got a timer, kind of like those of us who are older. Our grandmas all had these timers on their stove where, it was a little white porcelain thing, and you dial it to 30 seconds or whatever, and then it rings at the end. So I got that. And so instead of me saying, stop, you've gone too long, timer would just go off after 5 minutes, because that's how long it takes you to read 500 words. And so they'd blame the timer instead of me, like going, oh, that timer. Yeah, I said, oh, yeah, too bad. Then I noticed how the writers were coming early to class, so they'd sit right next to me, so they would be the first one to read, because I'd go around the table clockwise. When I was at Seeing Eye School getting my first dog, there were people there who could play Scrabble. They had a Scrabble with Braille on the tile, and I was intrigued by that. And I did get a game here, but I found it too difficult. My Braille skills aren't great. Do you play Scrabble?
I played a few times, not consistently. I'm not very good at it.
Okay. Well, there's triple word counter, but if you're blind, you have to feel the whole board to see, does anybody else have tiles on those things yet? It just was too hard for my little brain to handle. So I had the Scrabble board at home, not doing anything, and I had the Scrabble tiles with Braille on it, and then I had this idea. And I got a little pouch, and I put the alphabet A through Z in that little Scrabble, and in that little pouch, all those tiles, and then the little bag would go around at class, and everybody would pick a tile, and whoever picked A would go first, and whoever picked B would go second. So that worked until I figured out that people were picking one, and then they were putting it back because it was too, like it was X or something, so they didn't want that. So they went. So sometimes I would go backward. I can do ZYXWVUTS. That's one of my skills, that I can read the alphabet backwards in my head. So yeah, they pick a tile, and then it's their turn to read, and then they read their essay, and then we talk about it, and then we go to the next one. So that's how my class works.
Teaching truly is an art. You just
Yes.
never know what to expect. You have to prepare for so much. I've done a little bit of teaching, and I'll tell you what, it is a hard job.
Yes, that's why I said no, not because it was hard, but I just respected. I visit kids in classes sometimes just to talk about service dogs and stuff, and just because I like to go to elementary schools. But even if I'm just there for 45 minutes, I'm kind of worn out. I think, oh my God, these teachers are here all day. They're unsung heroes sometimes.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. I could go on and on about that. And so you mentioned that you and your guide dog, Luna, will go to, various teaching and speaking events, particularly at elementary schools. Is it ever challenging to work with a guide dog?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can be. I think with most of the schools in the United States, if you have trouble, you can call the school, and for example, Luna did on some intersections. When I first got her home, we trained together in February of 2020, and then we came home in March 2020 when COVID hit, so we didn't get to go out much. There was nowhere to go. I mean, I took little walks. But anyway, on some intersections, we're supposed to go straight across, but she kind of weaves to the left and then goes back. She goes out a little way and then she goes back. So a trainer came out to watch her, and he said, oh, yeah, some of these dogs do it. They call it arcing. She goes, arcing, A-R-C. She does this arc, and then she comes back. And so they taught me how to not get her to do that, or what I should do to get her to go straight and things like that. So, yeah, it can be a problem that way. But I trust the school you went to. They've got your back, and they'll help you out. When I'm traveling sometimes, especially lately, it's been very, very cold here. And so you kind of wish, a cane would be a lot nicer because you don't have to bring a cane out 4 times a day. You're staying at the hotel. You got to figure out how to go and where to go and come back. But, talking to you by phone rather than and sitting in front of my computer. And I chose the phone, thought you would be able to hear me. And during this whole conversation, I've been petting my dog and rubbing her belly and stuff like that. So she's right here. You can't see her. But yeah.
Well, they're amazing companions.
Yes, she's so much of a comfort. And if you are blind and you have a cane, people don't really talk to you much, or they don't engage you in conversation when you're waiting at a bus stop or something. But if you are blind and you have a dog, you're kind of the cool person. So you might recognize by the way I'm blabbing on and on and on. I'm not shy. So I really enjoy people talking to me and getting to know, just like they talk to anybody else. And when I'm with people who can see and I'm working with her, they said, God, everybody smiles when they see you coming through with your dog. So I kind of like that. She's given me she's my 5th seeing eye dog. And right from the start, it gives you a sense of dignity that I didn't have.
Absolutely. And I think the work that you do speaking to children about disability awareness and service animals is so important, because I know for myself, I didn't learn about service animal etiquette until my adulthood. And I think it should be, permanently built into early childhood education just across the board. So from your experience and your teaching, what do you wish more people knew when it comes to encountering service dogs?
The first thing is not to talk to them. And I know that's so hard for people because they even say, I know I'm not supposed to talk to her, but I love dogs, so I have to talk. But just even talking to a dog that's working distracts them. I don't think people understand that, yes, the dog knows you're talking, even if you don't know their name. You look at them going, So, and I think I'd like people to know that distracting service dog, when she and I are walking down the street, or especially when we're crossing a road, that's a very hard job. When she's getting me away, so I don't, if the sidewalk, there might be a hole in the sidewalk that wasn't there before. She'll stop and get me around it. And if you talk to her, she'll look at you instead of me, instead of helping me. And for that moment, we could get in a lot of trouble. I mean, we could get hurt. We could fall on there's a lot of correct sidewalks. And same with petting them. This is kind of what I say to the 3rd grade classes. So don't talk to them. Don't pet them while they're working, because that also, especially in our neighborhood, around people that I'm going to see more than once. You pet Luna once wherever we were in the lobby of our apartment. So, okay, you pet her, blah, blah. And then a couple days later, you're across the street and I'm walking down the street on the other side and she sees you. These dogs aren't perfect. She could, jaywalk and try to get to you because that's the lady that pet me. It's
right.
Easy to distract them, and their work is so important. And so literally life and death. So yeah, just look at them and smile. And Yes. And actually, that's what I like the best. I like if I'm out and about in the neighborhood and somebody says, hey, I saw you guys crossing, but I didn't say anything. That's the best thing you could say, because then I could say, well, how'd we look? Was she crossing straight? So I appreciate them telling me later, but not disturbing us.
Yeah. I think that education is so important because I think, so much of the time we have good intentions when we want to, go up and say hi to a service dog. But like you said, they're doing sometimes life-saving work. And so it's important to have those messages out there of, this is what you should and shouldn't do when you encounter a service dog. So I think that the work you do with elementary students is so important in that effort. And I want to ask Beth, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know about you and your work or anything else?
I guess not specifically about me, but I just having a disability or something. A lot of us have the same concerns and same likes and the same, I go to theater, I go to hear music, I would like people not to make an assumption because of someone's disability of what they enjoy or what they can and can't do, what they appreciate, what kind of skills they have, like anybody else. And I can only speak for myself. I don't mind at all if people ask me about my blindness, but I know that everybody's different. So, but you asked specifically about me. You could ask me questions about blindness, and if I find them uncomfortable, I just won't answer that question. But don't mind talking about it. It's not something ashamed of, and it is part of my life. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And where can listeners get in touch with you if they want to learn more or, ask those questions?
Yeah, I have a website, and it is bethfinke.com. So that's EETH, F like in Frank, INKE.com. There's a Contact Beth button there. Be honest, I have been really, since the pandemic, I got to look at that website a little bit more. I got to put some of these events I've been doing. It's not up to date in some ways, but there's information about the memoir classes I lead. There's a link to, if anybody's interested in leading memoir classes the way I do, I have some instructions online. It's a really easy model. Come up with good ideas for them what to write about. They go home and write them. They read them out loud. It is a joy, and I've learned so much about history from these people just reading their essays every week about them. I've made friends with the people in classes. Saturday, I was at a funeral. I mean, these people are older. For a woman in one of my classes who was 101. She died at 100. And she's African American. She grew up in the Chicago South Side. She went to school before Brown versus Board of Education was passed. And she wrote about what school was like. We'll all miss her, but it's such a gratifying work to teach people to do memoir writing because we have her stories. I have all her stories because she wrote them. And boy, and the people that were at the funeral, a lot of them came up to me and thanked me for encouraging her to write because they have these stories down. So important work, and a lot of older people aren't listened to. I believe they ought to be. So helps them with loneliness too. They come to class, they meet each other. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's something so beautiful, but also rare about that opportunity to, write a memoir and reflect on your life. I think that something everyone should do, but very scarcely do. We don't always get the opportunity to do that, but the stories it brings about are so important and something that everyone can learn from. So it certainly inspired me to try my hand at it.
Yes, you should. I have a class on Zoom if you want to join.
I would love to.
Oh, okay.
I really would. I think that's such an incredible opportunity and an amazing skill, to be able to write your life.
Yes, and to hear other people's. It's really, it's just wonderful. I mean, I'm so glad that woman that was in the Department on Aging asked me to do this. It's just great. I don't know if I'll ever stop.
You shouldn't. You should never stop. And Beth, thank you so much for joining us, for being on our podcast today. I really appreciate it.
I thank you for asking me too. It's an honor to speak with you. And I really like the ADA centers. So keep up the good work.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Emily Schumann, and Jessica Lucania is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DPAD0009-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.